Hello, everybody, and thank you for tuning in to the Liberty Report. With me today is Daniel McAdams, and Daniel, good to see you.
Good morning, Dr. Paul.
Good. I'd like to follow up on my weekly report on whether or not women should have to register for the draft. And there are some people, and sometimes I'd like to use a very nasty word about these people who do it. They think that it's best we have equality in this country. So if men are being punished, do we want equality? So we should punish the women equally, and therefore they should serve in the military, be in combat, and all, of course, be drafted. That contradicts this whole been in the news again. There's talk in Washington about it, and and nationally there are a lot more articles. And I keep thinking, you know, wonder why it's all of a sudden of interest. I hope they don't have a subtle, mysterious plan where they might need more troops. But anyway, it is out there, and there was some recent rumblings on the National Defense Authorization Act that Duncan Hunter came up with a bill, and I think you know something about that. Here, Duncan Hunter, you know, is positively opposed to women in the military, which is justifiable, but his is for the wrong reason. So he was being foolish in the committee, and he wanted to ridicule and mock them and say, well, you don't want women in combat, so we'll prevent them from being drafted. So he offers this amendment just as a joke and said the women will have to be registered. And he thought everybody would come down hard. Guess what? It passes the committee. So it's risky in Washington on what you might propose by being cynical. So now, here we have Duncan Hunter working now very hard on how he's going to make sure he defeats his own amendment when it comes to the House floor. Typical Washington legislation.
Talk about unintended consequences.
Yeah.
Well, you know, Carter signed, as you pointed out, back in 1980 in response to the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, Proclamation 4771, it was called. How ironic that 21 years later we invaded Afghanistan.
Yeah.
We never needed those troops. But, you know, we've had it through our history. This is the latest iteration. Nobody likes it. Nobody wants it, really. The military doesn't want it. Conservatives, many of them remember and don't want it. But somehow it's lost its sense of controversy. And I think it's the conflation with the word service, serving your country. It's ennobled. Whereas you would have a different S word, I think, to describe it, which is a word that's outlawed.
You know, and this has been around for so long. As long as we've had history, we've had compulsion of governments to use people to fight their wars. Matter of fact, it's in the Old Testament when the Israelites were unhappy because they didn't have a strong king. They were looking for a king. One of the things they wanted to have, conscription back again. And Samuel warned them, don't do it. They're going to have conscription, and then you're going to have unnecessary war and drag your kids. But that's, a couple thousand years ago they talked about this. Well, our history has been filled with it. And I want to read a quote from Daniel Webster to set the stage for the moral arguments against the draft. There's a lot of practical arguments against the draft, but in the War of 1812, when D.C. was under siege, Madison was promoting the idea that we have to have this draft in order to beat the British. So I need that up on the screen, please. So when this happened, of course, Daniel Webster went down to confront him. But he gives this very, very long spontaneous speech, which is just a great speech. But the one thing here that we've gotten out of the speech, a special quote. Here's Daniel Webster in the midst of this debate. A free government with an uncontrolled power of military conscription is the most ridiculous and abominable contradiction and nonsense that ever entered into the heads of men. Pretty strong, and of course I had a quote in my congressional office for a long time from Robert Taft, which wasn't quite that strong, but it was pretty good.
Yeah, it's very unfortunate now. We are talking about women being allowed in combat roles, and that is passed, and it's more of a social experiment, than the national defense issue. But it is very unfortunate that some of the people that may have been allies, anti-war allies, and would have been opposed to the draft may be sort of enticed into supporting this idea on the grounds that it represents some sort of equality for women, some sort of a great progress for women.
This is the bizarre nature of this argument when they don't understand what civil liberties are all about. So if somebody has a disadvantage and somebody isn't exposed to it, they think equality is making sure everybody is exposed to the disadvantage. They do this in taxation. Instead of saying, well, if somebody has less taxes than the other, why don't we just lower the taxes for everybody? But why should we think equality is equally punishing people? That's why I think the feminists were completely wrong on this issue and said, yeah, we want to be equal like men, and we want to make sure they can get shot at like a man. Now we want to make sure they can be drafted to go over and fight wars that we shouldn't be fighting. And they get satisfaction that, boy, this is equality for women. Well, if they're not under this, they have special protection. But I want equality for men too. I don't want anybody to be forced into these things, but to come up with a solution to saying that we're having more equal equality by punishing women the same way we punish men, which more or less is supporting for war in many different ways.
And if you can address the whole idea, there is a push for people across the spectrum, the idea of national service, and they dress it up to make it sound so nice. You got to serve your country. Give something back from what you give, what you've gotten.
I could describe what I think our national service about is that everybody taking care of themselves and minding our own business and not depending on anybody and not using the government to get special benefit. But in 1979, when this came up, I was working with some liberal Democrats, and one congresswoman I work with closely. On the first go-around, we won the vote. And we defeated the reinstitution of the draft. And immediately after that, she went downstairs. When we stopped the military draft, she introduced legislation for social services, and conscript everybody and how that. Gee, they're missing the point about what liberty is all about. But I was exposed to some discrepancy with the draft as well. The draft generally drafts people from 18 to the age of 25. And of course, it was stopped in the early 70s, but in the 60s, it was still on the books because the Vietnam crisis was going on, and I got my draft notice in 1962. But I was older than 25. I was nearly 28, had 2 kids and one on the way. But they called me up and went to San Law. But there was always a medical draft, an MD draft, which was different. They back then the medical draft law for doctors was up to the age of 51.
Wow.
You could draft them, and so there's everybody's equal except some people are more equal or more victimized than others. So I think this is. But this has been around for a long time. One of the moral arguments is, well, this is what you have to pay for your freedom. Sort of like Oliver Wendell Holmes says, don't sweat the taxes. That's what you pay for civilization, to have an uncivilized government stealing your money. But that's the argument of some. We have to pay for our freedom. How far do you think I should be able to get with that argument?
I thought our freedom came from our Creator. That's at least what the Declaration says.
And not our government.
The other thing, and this is more of a practical argument, Dr. Paul, and it actually, to be honest, it hits home because I have a 16-year-old son, and I've been thinking about this for a number of years. But if you look at the Selective Service registration, it sounds innocuous until you look at the details. What if you're not that enthused about doing it? The penalties might surprise some people. First of all, the legal penalties. Failing to register is a felony. You will always have a felony on your record. You face a $250,000 fine, 5 years in prison, or a combination of the two. The other things that happen if you don't register, you're ineligible for federal student aid, for most state student aid, for some state employment, security clearance, most federal employment, federal job training. If you're looking to get your citizenship, you're ineligible for that. On top of those federal penalties, there are additional state penalties that are put on people who don't register. And what's most insidious is a lot of states, including our beloved Texas, unfortunately, automatically registers you for the draft if you want to get a driver's license. So if you don't want to register, well, then you don't get to drive. You don't get to do any of these things. And the DMV automatically transfers electronically your information to the Selective Service without you knowing it.
Okay, but the argument from the other side is, well, there's no war going on, nobody's being drafted, so why worry about it? And if there is a major war, we'll need the men, and we need to get them, and I guess we'll need the women. So they justify this, and right now nobody really cares about that, because they're not concerned about liberty, and they can be convinced that, you know, ISIS is out there. You know, they might, you know, land their airplanes and shoot missiles at us or something someday. So we have to be ready for these troops.
Well, that's just like the Patriot Act. You remember at the time? What are you worried about? They're only going to spy on the bad guys. They're not gonna
the
bother
bad
you.
guys. That's
Until
right.
Snowden came around and we found out something
Yeah,
different.
all what they want to do to the jihadists, as well as what they're dealing with are the suspects that they may do harm. But one term that I used back in 1979 that has stuck, and I used it last week as well, to try to embarrass conservatives, because conservatives are pretty good in their arguments about not registering their guns. Why should they? I mean, that is the ultimate physical defense of an intrusive government, was the right to own weapons. That was why they wrote the Second Amendment. It wasn't for hunting. So that was, the conservatives understand this. So I said, I put it right on them. I said, you people, you conservatives, you think more of your guns than your kids. You're down here begging the government to register your kids. At the same time, you'll fight tooth and nail so your guns don't have to be registered. Why don't we make sure that we neither have to register our kids nor register our guns?
That sounds good. If I can just really quickly say one thing, and I think there are organizations out there that are helping young people struggling with this very serious issue to look at age 18. You know, our old friend Bill Galvin in the Center on Conscience and War, he's helped a lot of people, including our friends, the Pavonis, who got out of the Air Force, if you remember. But they have a wonderful website, Center on Conscience and War, and they give advice to young people who feel like they do not want to serve in the military, but they are obligated to register for the draft. And you could look on the site for more information, but they say, you know, print in legible black ink on every communication with Selective Service, I am a conscientious objector. Make copies of this. Make sure you prepare a personal statement of your beliefs to back it up. So there are steps you can take if you decide to go that route.
Right. You know, the Supreme Court ruled on this issue that we're talking about, women being registered, back in 1980. And they didn't act as civil libertarians, and they hadn't read Daniel Webster's speech at all. And their reasoning was, it was sort of pragmatic reasoning that Congress says they can't fight in combat, so why register them? So, you know, that was their argument. So they ruled against the forced registration of women. And besides, they said it was counter to American values, sending off women to defend our country. You know, well, what about sending men off to war needlessly by force to fight a war which is a preemptive war? Maybe there's immorality and not part of the American values. The trouble is, there's a lot of talk about American values and American exceptionalism, but there's a lot of confusion about really what has made our country a little bit more special than others, and it happens to be the principle of civil liberties and personal liberties and not collective liberties, and all this confusion about the draft, the women's draft and the doctored draft and preemptive war, or ignore the Constitution on declaring war. We have to be prepared. There's so little concern about that, and so they nitpick this. So the Supreme Court didn't do anything. They could have sorted it out and just wrote something that said the whole draft ought to be thrown out, not just the registration of the draft for women.
How sad, that great point you made. Everyone's remembered the slogans of American exceptionalism without actually remembering what it is that makes us exceptional.
That is for sure. Well, unfortunately, I'm afraid this issue is going to stay around for a while, and hopefully it does, and we can build momentum to explain to the American people and the young people. This should be a young person's issue. But you know, they are saying that it's necessary. The left, or one of the arguments the left uses, is we need massive registration because then we will make the people more anti-war. Because it was the draft and it was all the slaughter in the 1960s of Vietnam that woke up the people. But why can't we wake up the people before that happens? But there's some of the anti-war people who were against the draft in the 60s now say, let's have the draft, and then the people will start to rebel against these constant wars in the Middle East. But that, again, sacrificing more liberty to try to make a point which is supposed to be protection of our liberties makes no sense whatsoever. It should be based on one principle, and that is what liberty is all about. And the other thing that we drift into and make so many mistakes about is the fact that we see people in groups that need protection or penalties where it's always the individual that counts. So this is an important point. And also, one thing that people forget about when they're defining civil liberties is they don't talk about property being a civil liberty. And so much violation has occurred, against our liberties because they violate our properties. They know that we have a certain amount of privacy in our house, less so now with the surveillance going on. But in a way, the house is supposed to be our castle. But as soon as you step out of your house and into your store up front, all of a sudden you don't have any rights. But it's the property, it's the church property or the synagogue property. That's what protects us, or whether it's the property of the TV station or our computers. So property is very important protection of civil liberties. But right now, there's a lot of confusion. This debate that's going on now is making it worse. And in a way, it's ironic that Duncan Hunter is now all confused because he has to get rid of his own amendment because he was just making fun of it because he wants he wants the draft, he wants the men, but of course he thinks it's a disadvantage militarily to have women. He doesn't deal with the issue of liberty. That's what this program attempts to do. We work very hard at it because the issue is liberty, and that to me is most important. I want to thank everybody for tuning in today to the Liberty Report. Please come back soon.